The morning of January 26, 1967, began like any other winter Thursday in Chicago. Downtown, the Loop hummed with its usual rhythm. Streetcars rattled along State Street, their overhead wires throwing blue-white sparks into the cold air. Factory whistles echoed from the south side, marking the start of the second shift. The smell of the city in winter hung everywhere: coal smoke from furnaces, wet wool from commuters' coats, the metallic tang of slush kicked up by passing cars. Lake Michigan stretched flat and gray to the east, its surface locked under a sheet of pale ice that extended nearly to the horizon. The temperature hovered around 20 degrees, unremarkable for late January. At the Weather Bureau office on West Jackson Boulevard, forecasters tracked a low-pressure system moving northeast from Missouri. They expected snow, perhaps 3 to 5 inches, maybe 8 at most. Winter storms were routine in Chicago. The city had seen worse, but the models were missing something. Two air masses were converging over the Great Lakes, one bitterly cold from Canada, the other unseasonably warm and moisture-laden from the Gulf of Mexico. Between them, conditions were aligning for something the city hadn't experienced in decades. By mid-morning, the sky began to change. The flat gray gave way to something darker, heavier. Clouds moved in low and fast from the southwest. The wind, which had been light, started to build, first in gusts, then steady, pushing against the faces of pedestrians on Michigan Avenue. Office workers glanced out windows and reached for their coats a little earlier than usual. Mothers hurried children home from school. Bus drivers noticed the streets getting slick. Just after noon, the first flakes began to fall. At first they were light, almost delicate, the kind of snow that might dust the sidewalks and melt by evening. But within an hour the flakes grew larger, falling faster, driven sideways by winds that were now howling through the canyons of downtown. Visibility dropped. The sky turned white. By 2 o'clock, Chicago was inside the storm. Traffic slowed to a crawl on the Eisenhower Expressway. Streetlights flickered on early, their glow diffused through the thickening snow. The temperature plummeted. What had been slush became ice beneath a blanket of accumulation that was already measuring in inches, not flurries. The Weather Bureau revised its forecast. 6 to 10 inches now. Possibly more. They had no idea. By the time the evening rush hour began, the city was already beginning to seize. Chicago, in 1967, was a city that prided itself on infrastructure. It had one of the most extensive public transit systems in the United States, an elevated rail network that carried hundreds of thousands of passengers daily, a fleet of buses that served every neighborhood, streetcars still running on certain routes. The city had survived the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and a century of brutal winters. It knew how to handle snow. Or so it believed. What the city didn't have was a coordinated emergency snow removal plan. Equipment was outdated. Many plows dated back to the 1940s. There were no salt reserves large enough to treat major arterials for more than a few hours. Communication between departments, streets, sanitation, transit, was fragmented at best. The storm exposed every gap. Chicago's Department of Streets and Sanitation had prepared for a typical winter event, a manageable snowfall spread over several hours, giving crews time to clear main roads in shifts. But the 1967 blizzard didn't follow that pattern. Snow fell at rates exceeding 2 inches per hour. Winds gusted to 53 miles per hour, creating drifts that buried entire intersections within minutes of being cleared. By mid-afternoon, plows were stuck. Salt trucks ran out of material. Tow trucks couldn't reach abandoned cars. The meteorology itself had been deceptive. Forecasters relied on surface observations and upper-air data from weather balloons, but the storm's behavior over the Great Lakes created anomalies their models couldn't interpret. Warm air aloft held massive amounts of moisture, while cold air at the surface turned everything into heavy, wet snow, the kind that stuck to power lines, weighed down trees, and packed into dense, immovable drifts. Lake Michigan acted as a fuel source. The relatively warmer water pumped additional moisture into the system, a phenomenon called lake effect enhancement. The storm fed on itself, intensifying as it stalled over the city. Chicago Transit Authority buses, designed to handle winter streets, began to fail. Transmissions overheated. Wheels spun uselessly in deepening snow. By 4 o'clock, dozens of buses were simply abandoned in place, their drivers and passengers trapped inside. The elevated trains fared no better. Ice formed on the third rail, cutting power to entire sections of track. Switches froze. Trains that had left the loop at 3 o'clock were still crawling through the south side at 6, packed with standing passengers, heat failing, windows frosting over. Underground, the city's utilities strained. Power lines sagged under the weight of ice and snow. Transformers began to fail. Entire neighborhoods went dark, not from a single catastrophic failure, but from a cascade of small breakdowns that outpaced repair crews. The city had no backup plan, because it had never imagined needing one on this scale. By nightfall, Chicago wasn't just slowed down, it was paralyzed. His name was Frank Sabal, and he had been driving the number 9 Ashland bus for 11 years. He knew every stop, every pothole, every timing of every traffic light from downtown to the city limits. On the morning of January 26, he reported for his shift at 1 o'clock, expecting a routine afternoon run, maybe slower than usual, maybe a few stuck cars to navigate around, but nothing he hadn't handled 100 times before. By 3 o'clock, he was stranded at the corner of Ashland and Division. The snow had come down so fast, so thick, that within an hour the street was unrecognizable. Cars sat buried to their door handles. Drifts climbed halfway up storefronts. The wind roared down Ashland Avenue like a freight train, pushing walls of white across the road faster than any plow could clear them. Sabal's bus had 42 passengers. Some had boarded downtown, expecting a 20-minute ride home. Others had climbed aboard at later stops, grateful for shelter as the storm worsened. Now they sat in silence, watching through fogged windows as the city disappeared. He tried to move the bus. The engine roared, the wheels spun, the vehicle rocked slightly but didn't budge. Snow had packed beneath the undercarriage, lifting the rear wheels off the pavement. He was stuck. He shut off the engine to save fuel and turned to face his passengers. "We're going to be here a while," he said. No one argued. The hours that followed were defined by small sounds and long silences. The wind rattling the bus's metal frame, the hiss of snow against the windows, the occasional creak of a seat as someone shifted position, breath condensing in the cooling air. Some passengers dozed, others stared out into the white. A woman near the back shared a thermos of coffee. A man offered cigarettes, which Sabal declined but others accepted, smoking carefully near the cracked window at the rear exit. The cold crept in slowly. The bus's residual heat faded within the first hour. By 5 o'clock, passengers were wrapping scarves tighter, pulling coats closed, sitting closer together. Sabal stayed in his seat, hands on the wheel even though there was nowhere to go. He had a wife at home, 2 daughters. He'd told them he'd be back by 6. They'd be worrying by now. Outside, the storm showed no sign of stopping. Visibility was near zero. He couldn't see the buildings across the street. He couldn't see the cars buried beside him. The city had vanished into white noise and darkness. At 7 o'clock, a police officer appeared at the door, materializing out of the blizzard like a ghost. He was covered head to toe in snow, his uniform frozen stiff, his face raw from the wind. He knocked on the glass. Sabal opened the door. A blast of cold air and snow rushed in. "Everyone okay in here?" the officer asked. "So far," Sabal said. "Stay put, don't try to leave the bus. We're sending plows, but it's going to be hours." "How many hours?" The officer didn't answer. He nodded once and stepped back into the storm. Sabal closed the door. At midnight, 12 hours after he'd started his shift, the bus was still buried. Passengers had grown quiet. Some slept sitting up. Others stared into the dark. The temperature inside had dropped to just above freezing. Frank Sabal sat in his seat, still in uniform, waiting for the city to dig him out. By midnight on January 26, Chicago had ceased to function. More than 20,000 vehicles sat abandoned on city streets, some buried so completely they wouldn't be found for days. The Kennedy Expressway, one of the busiest highways in the Midwest, was a parking lot of snow-covered cars stretching for miles in both directions. Drivers who tried to push through early in the storm were now trapped, some still sitting in their vehicles, others walking through waist-deep drifts toward any light they could see. The elevated train system, the backbone of the city's transit network, ground to a halt. Trains sat frozen on elevated tracks above the south and west sides, their doors sealed shut by ice, passengers huddled inside unheated cars. Some trains lost power entirely. Conductors radioed for help that couldn't come. Passengers broke windows to climb down onto platforms, then waded through snow to reach the street below. At Union Station and the LaSalle Street Station, thousands of commuters who tried to leave the city found themselves stranded. Trains couldn't leave. Buses couldn't arrive. The stations became makeshift shelters, men in suits sleeping on wooden benches, women huddled in waiting rooms, children wrapped in coats, lying on the floor. Ambulances couldn't move. At Cook County Hospital, emergency room staff watched the parking lot fill with snow while dispatch calls came in from across the city, heart attacks, injuries, emergencies that couldn't be reached. Nurses and doctors who'd finished their shifts couldn't leave. Those scheduled to arrive for the night shift couldn't get there. The hospital operated on skeleton crews, staff working double and triple shifts, sleeping in break rooms between calls. Power began to fail in waves. Transformers overloaded and exploded, sending cascades of sparks into the snow. Entire blocks went dark, streetlights, traffic signals, homes. Crews from Commonwealth Edison fought their way through the streets in trucks, but for every line they restored, 2 more went down. Grocery stores emptied within hours. Delivery trucks carrying food, milk, bread, anything fresh, were stranded outside the city on highways that had become impassable. What remained on shelves was bought immediately. Stores that tried to stay open found themselves without power, their refrigeration failing, perishable goods spoiling in the dark. The storm had done what no enemy, no disaster, no crisis in the city's history had managed to do. It had severed Chicago's ability to move, to communicate, to sustain itself. By dawn on January 27, the snow was still falling. The official measurement at O'Hare Airport read 23 inches, the most snow from a single storm in Chicago's recorded history. But in many neighborhoods, drifts had piled 10, 12, even 15 feet high. Side streets were buried. Cars had vanished. Entire blocks looked like white wastelands, indistinguishable from parks or empty lots. The city government struggled to respond. Mayor Richard J. Daley ordered every available plow into the streets, but there weren't nearly enough. Crews worked around the clock, clearing major arterials only to watch them fill again within hours. The sheer volume of snow overwhelmed the city's equipment. Plows broke down. Drivers collapsed from exhaustion. Neighborhoods began to organize on their own. Residents emerged from homes with shovels, forming impromptu crews to dig out elderly neighbors, clear paths to corner stores, free cars one by one. In some areas, people carved tunnels through drifts to reach the street. In others, they simply gave up and waited. The airport remained closed. No flights in or out. O'Hare's runways were buried under snow that would take days to remove. The port of Chicago was frozen solid. And still the wind howled. 26 people died during the blizzard. Some froze in their cars, engines running until the fuel ran out, exhaust pipes buried in snow, carbon monoxide seeping into cabins. Others collapsed while walking through the storm, trying to reach home, trying to find help, overcome by cold and exhaustion before they could reach shelter. A few died from heart attacks while shoveling snow, the physical strain too much for bodies unaccustomed to such effort. The deaths were scattered across the city, south side, north side, suburbs, each one quiet, each one alone. Thousands more were stranded but survived. Office workers slept on desks and floors, wrapped in coats, waiting for streets to clear. Factory workers stayed at their posts, unable to leave, unable to be replaced. Hotel lobbies filled with people who'd never made it home, businessmen, families, strangers sleeping in chairs and hallways. At Michael Reese Hospital, a nurse named Dorothy Hamill walked 6 miles through the storm to reach her shift. She waded through drifts chest-high, followed streetcar tracks when sidewalks disappeared, and arrived at the hospital 9 hours after leaving home. Other staff did the same. They had no choice. People needed care. For 3 days, the city remained effectively shut down. Schools stayed closed. Most businesses couldn't open. Mail wasn't delivered. Garbage wasn't collected. The snow sat where it had fallen, and in many places it would remain for weeks. On January 28, the sun finally broke through. The temperature stayed cold, but the wind died. The sky turned a brittle, pale blue. Sunlight reflected off the snow with a brightness that made it hard to look at directly. Slowly, the city began to dig itself out. Army National Guard units were deployed to help clear streets. Bulldozers joined plows. Dump trucks hauled snow to Lake Michigan, where it was pushed onto the ice in massive white mountains. Crews worked in 12-hour shifts, carving narrow lanes through residential neighborhoods, 1 block at a time. Elevated trains resumed limited service. Buses began running on major routes. Commuters returned to work in waves, first those who could walk, then those who could drive, finally those whose neighborhoods had been cleared last. But the scars remained. Cars sat buried for weeks, their owners unable to locate them beneath drifts. When the snow finally melted in March, entire neighborhoods discovered vehicles they hadn't known were there, parked, abandoned, frozen in place for 2 months. The city government faced intense criticism. Residents demanded answers. Why hadn't streets been cleared faster? Why were some neighborhoods prioritized over others? Why had the city been so unprepared? Mayor Daley faced a political crisis. In neighborhoods where snow removal lagged, often poorer areas, often minority communities, anger turned into action. Community groups organized. Complaints were filed. The blizzard became a rallying point for deeper frustrations about inequality, infrastructure, and neglect. In response, the city overhauled its snow removal system. New plows were purchased. Salt reserves were tripled. Emergency protocols were written and tested. Coordination between departments was streamlined. Chicago invested millions into preparing for the next storm. But the lessons went beyond logistics. The 1967 blizzard revealed something fundamental about cities: how fragile they are, how dependent on systems that most people never see, how quickly order can break down when those systems fail. It also revealed something about resilience: the neighbors who dug each other out, the workers who walked miles to reach their posts, the bus driver who stayed with his passengers, the nurse who waded through snow because people needed care. Frank Sabal was finally freed from his bus at 2 o'clock in the morning on January 27, 14 hours after he'd gotten stuck. He drove the empty bus back to the depot, filed his report, and went home. His daughters were asleep. His wife had been awake all night. He took the next day off, then he went back to work. By mid-February, life in Chicago had returned to something close to normal. The snow melted slowly, streets dried, the city moved again. But for those who lived through it, the memory remained: a white sky, a silent city, the wind howling through empty streets. Lake Michigan, still frozen, reflected the pale morning light. The city rose around it, scarred but standing, buried and dug out, stopped and restarted. Chicago endured. It always had.